Legislative Counsel with Michigan Farm Bureau, and this evening, welcome to the September edition of Michigan Farm Bureau's Hitching Post. We're going to discuss a variety of topics related to international trade this evening. As I said, my name is John Kran, and we have two special guests with us this evening, two people that we as staff rely on heavily here at Michigan Farm Bureau, Veronica Nigh with American Farm Bureau and Dr. Aleks Schaefer with Michigan State University, both economists and both specialists in their field. Our goal of the Hitching Post is to bring Michigan Farm Bureau staff, industry professionals, and members into your home, your farm shop, or tractor each month and allow you to hear what's going on firsthand with policy, commodities, markets, and more. Feel free to submit any questions you'd like our panel to answer using the Q&A box, and we will try our best to get to those throughout the conversation. We're recording today's Hitching Post, so if you want to go back and re-listen, share this video with others. The link will be available by this coming Thursday on both the Michigan Farm Bureau Facebook page and our Michigan Farm Bureau YouTube page. So with that, let me introduce our first topic here this evening is international trade. And just as kind of a precursor, this is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of us. I think we've been hearing about trade in the media probably more in the last 2-3 years than we have in a long time, from trade with China to the renegotiated US-Mexico-Canada agreement and many more. It's been top of mind to a lot of our members. And when this webinar is over, we'll have a link that you can follow and look more in depth at Michigan Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau policies. But I just wanted to briefly mention to you what really the scope is of American Farm Bureau, our national policy on trade. And we're really looking at it from two angles. One is opening up markets for free and fair trade so that we can get corn, soybeans, wheat, cattle, hogs, and a variety of other things into markets around the world because we tend to produce more than we can consume in this country, and it helps us to improve prices overall for domestic producers. But we also are sensitive to import pressure, especially for things that are labor intensive, like the production of fruits and vegetables, where we've continued to see more and more competitors erode our domestic market for those commodities. So we want to talk about both of these things in policy. I think it's also worth mentioning that Michigan Farm Bureau was very instrumental this last year. So our county members talked a lot about the foreign competition impacting fruits and vegetables. And we were able to get some of that language inserted into the American Farm Bureau policy last year. So your actions speak loudly and have helped drive a lot of our national conversation. And so that you know that your involvement is crucial to this organization, and we hope that you continue to have those conversations about policy at the county level, and we hope that this conversation this evening helps spur some additional thoughts for you as you develop your policy. So with that, I'll stop my long-winded introduction, and I'd like to now, I'll start first with Veronica Nigh from American Farm Bureau. So Veronica, if you could just briefly introduce yourself, give us a little bit of your background, and maybe give us about 5-6 minutes of just what you see happening on the national scene with trade.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks very much, John, and thanks very much for having me be a part of this evening's program. So I am an economist at the American Farm Bureau Federation. I predominantly cover trade, labor, transportation, and food safety type of issues. And I like to joke that those are, of course, all the things that everyone agrees on all the time. So a very calm portfolio. And as John said, this has been in the last several years, we've talked about a lot. Sort of going back since the mid 70s, early 70s, the U.S. has really turned itself into an export-oriented agricultural system. Even though we only account for about 2 to 3% of the GDP overall of the U.S. economy, and less than that on employment, we certainly have an oversized share in the trade arena. On average, the U.S. exports about 20 to 25% of the total value of our production to other markets. So of course it's it's an incredibly important element of the demand side for U.S. ag products. Now that, of course, has come through a lot of different actions. Every country around the world, the U.S. included, maintains barriers to some to imports in the form of tariffs and sometimes quantitative limits on the amount of products that can come in. Over the years, the world's kind of got together and said, hey, you know, I think it would be better if we had fewer barriers. And so through both multilateral negotiations at the WTO and then bilateral negotiations and things like USMCA that John mentioned, we've agreed to lower the barriers to imports into the U.S. In turn, because the other countries that we're negotiating with lower the barriers to U.S. ag products. And by and large, it's been a fairly successful endeavor for U.S. agriculture. We tend to have a positive trade balance in U.S. ag. But there's a number of things sort of going on right now that have caused that to sort of be called into question in the last couple of years as to whether or not we continue to maintain a positive trade balance. And that would just mean that we're positive trade balance means that we're exporting more than we're importing. In fact, so far, January through July of this year, we actually have a negative trade balance of $3.5 billion. And that's only the second time since 1970 that we've had a negative trade balance through that portion of the year. The only other time was last year when we had a negative trade balance of 38 billion. So there's a number of things sort of going on that's leading to that. One, of course, is COVID and the impact that that's globally having on demand. Where all consumers around the world are having a difficult time maintaining their lifestyle because of the limitations on work and seeing that ripple throughout a wide variety of products, ag included. Now, as COVID is we're 6 months in the US, and as that's sort of unfolded, we have seen things starting to get back to normal some, but there are some sort of residual impacts that are occurring that are worth discussing. Things like what happens in the transportation realm. When COVID first began and sort of transportation of products globally stopped, it will take a long time to get the transportation channels sort of back to normal. And so even though the demand side might be starting to rebound now, we're still dealing with those residual transportation issues. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing is, of course, the US dollar is relatively weak against some of the other currencies around the world, which should make us should increase US ag exports. But because of all of the retaliatory tariff action that we have, the US has put tariffs on a number of countries for various reasons, and those countries have retaliated. We do have a fairly high level of additional tariff on US ag goods in other markets like China and on some products in the EU that has made US products less competitive than they would be otherwise. So there's a lot of things sort of going on that are impacting that trade balance. We're not really seeing any particular market or any particular product as the culprit for that decline. But of course, that is something that we're keeping an eye on. The other big thing, of course, that's in the news a lot, and you're probably tired of talking about China. I think everybody's a little tired of talking about China. But because it is such a big market, back in January, the U.S. signed a phase 1 trade agreement with China that basically involved China promising to buy about $36 billion worth of U.S. ag products to import that value. Well, that's a considerable amount of ag product. The most the U.S. had ever exported to China previous to that was around 23, 24 billion. So we're now 7 months in on trade data, and so far China has imported only about $8 billion worth of U.S. ag products, and they're going to need to import about $23 billion more in order to meet the obligations of the phase one deal. So in 5 months. So that's a pretty big burden, or pretty high bar for them to reach. And then finally, John did mention, of course, in an ideal world, we all have low barriers to trade and we're able to trade back and forth easily and everyone does it fairly. But sometimes that doesn't work out. The world isn't run by Pollyanna, and sometimes our partners don't play fairly. So there are some measures that the U.S. can take, that other countries can take as well, in order to sort of punish bad behavior of other countries. And that's in the form of things like the retaliatory or the tariffs. In the U.S., we have a 301 process, we have a 201, we have a 232. They're basically all different instruments to apply to sort of do an investigation against another country or a group of countries to say, are you following the rules that we've all agreed to? And after an investigation, if we find that you aren't, then we're going to put tariffs on products from your country in order to try to counterbalance that unfairness. So we can talk more about that, but certainly the seasonal aspect, or the trade of seasonal products, this has been something that has come up many times over the years, and recent action by the administration to launch a 201 investigation on blueberries, I know, is of particular interest to Michigan, and what that might mean going into the future, not only for that crop but others. So that's sort of the horizon right now on a federal level. So I'll turn it back to you, John, to talk a little bit more about the state level stuff.
Thank you, Veronica. I appreciate that update, and I'm sure we've got some questions that will be coming in shortly on some of the things you mentioned. Next, we have Dr. Aleks Schaefer, professor from Michigan State University, who specializes in trade and law. And Dr. Schaefer, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, John. So I talked to John and Veronica quickly this morning, and I kind of came in puffing my chest thinking, look at me, I'm this amazing expert in law and international trade. And just knowing how on the ball these guys are, I know that I gotta kind of take a step back and watch because they're way ahead of the game. That being said, I guess I can talk about kind of where I'm from, and I guess what I see as the issues specific to Michigan, kind of additionally to what Veronica talked about. So I love school. I've been in school like approximately forever. So I did a law degree specializing in international trade. And then I just didn't have enough school, so I went and got a PhD focusing on agricultural policy, international trade. I've done some policy work. So I worked at the World Bank working on kind of global livestock regulations. I was in London for a while at the University of London, working on kind of livestock and international trade regulations. And so I have now moved to Michigan State University. I've been here just officially like a year and a couple weeks. The sky has fallen since I moved here. So I used to think I was an international trade guy, but mostly now I'm just trying to understand what the world looks like. And so I guess taking a step back, how I think about an international trade, right? They both hinted at this in that it's a pretty simple equation, right? Facilitation of international markets is a really good thing for products that the U.S. is an exporter of. It's also a good thing for the U.S. as a whole for products that the U.S. is an importer of, but for producers domestically, increased competition from imports hurts us. So we've got to think about both sides of that equation. Michigan is I guess, especially interesting, but also frustrating in that we've got kind of all of those issues facing us, right? We do the soybeans, corn, beef, pork, but we also do those tons and tons of specialty crops. And so much of the story that Veronica was talking about those high export crops, where in Michigan we've also got the specialty crops in which we tend to be importers. I won't restate all of the evolution of international trade that Veronica, or international trade policy that Veronica walked through so well. So I guess I will just specifically talk about the markets that we are strong in. So soybeans, yes, like Veronica said, we've seen a drop off recently, which is mostly because of that retaliatory tariffs. Interestingly though, when you look at that data and you look at where that drop off occurred, it's primarily in kind of our minor markets, and that's also a function of those retaliatory tariffs, which we put those tariffs on the steel and aluminum products kind of globally, and a whole bunch of people, not just China, not just the EU, responded, and so we've been hurt in a whole lot of markets. The same story, we're down in corn, beef. But then pork is the opposite story, that we can't shovel the pork out fast enough, right? I think pork exports have increased 70% or something. John can correct me on the exact number. There is good news in both the soybean and corn, that if you look at the pace of advanced export sales, those suckers are picking up. I think we're something like 400% over where we were last year in terms of advanced export sales. So yes, it's almost certain that China's not going to reach where they are on the phase one trade deal, but we are seeing a big uptick in terms of international trade. I guess one thing that I'm slightly concerned about in terms of on the policy front that Veronica didn't necessarily talk about, and maybe we're not supposed to talk about, is the fact that in substitution for kind of those open markets, we've seen this rapid or dramatic increase in the use of ad hoc payments to try to make industries whole. That's a good thing in the short term, because we're seeing, we've kind of seen this march in terms of falling farm incomes, but in the long run, it seems scarier and scarier in my mind to rely on these ad hoc payments. One, because we're not letting market signals necessarily drive what we're producing and trading, and two, because of the fact that they're ad hoc payments, it's a really uncertain realm in terms of when will the next one come, what will it be, which makes that kind of market environment really concerning for farmers, for all stakeholders. Okay, so I guess the other things that I just want to quickly mention, I don't think we can, just like Veronica said, I don't think we can talk about trade policy alone without thinking about some other underlying fundamentals that are changing dramatically, like labor scarcity. Obviously, that's going to be exacerbated by COVID, but the more scarce our labor is, especially in the specialty crops arena, that drives our prices up relative to the competition. And so maybe we'll have some of those anti-dumping, countervailing duties, special safeguards policies, which can give us some temporary relief, but importantly, those things are really temporary. And so thinking into the future, we've got to think about, I guess, as the specialty crops in Michigan, how do we successfully differentiate ourselves in terms of just signaling to the consumer, educating the consumer that we're producing a higher quality, a different product than Mexico or Peru or Turkey. I guess the last thing, which is the elephant in all rooms right now, right, is COVID. We're in a dramatic recession. Obviously, that's been gumming up transportation, like Veronica said, and we will hear more about. It also really changes the way, not only how much food consumers demand, but the way consumers demand food. So I checked the other day, and SNAP enrollments have increased by something like 80% since March or April, which is a dramatic increase. It changes the way that consumers are purchasing agricultural products, purchasing food products. Additionally, we've seen this move away from restaurants, away from food services, towards grocery stores. And in some senses, that's positive because I think we're able to more clearly signal our differentiated products, but also consumers are going to purchase differently at grocery stores. And because we've got these reduced incomes for a lot of people, that's going to make it harder, I guess, to compete on quality as incomes fall. That is my whole rant, John. It is totally back to you, man.
That wasn't a rant. That was good stuff. Appreciate that. I got a lot of questions coming to my head already, but I wanted to start now with a question we got from a member of the audience, and I'll read it first. This is probably for Veronica, but either of you feel free to chime in. Recently, I've been hearing about the Mexican government wanting to ban genetically modified products. What is the status of this, and how would it affect U.S.-Mexico trade? Furthermore, does the USMCA have any protections against Mexico banning our GMOs?
That's a good question. So the USMCA does have provisions to actually increase the exchange of information of biotech crops to try to expedite the approval of new traits. Where we've been running into issues with Mexico of late is twofold. One is they've been slow on approving new traits, which is a bit out of the China playbook. Though it seems to be for a bit of a different reason. The Mexican government lost a lot of high-level folks in sort of the ag space, and communication has not been good between various sectors of government to try to get approvals. And so that's frankly just an inefficiency. The other area, though, that's of probably greater concern is the move against glyphosate and potentially limiting the use of glyphosate, which would, of course, be a big deal for U.S. crops. So the USMCA, like all bilateral trade agreements, like all multilateral trade agreements, does have provisions in there to help sort of like a dispute settlement type of provision, a court system, so that we have some recourse, so that we have a forum to have discussions about issues that are bothering each party. So right now we have not reached the level of having a dispute with Mexico. This is still in the fairly nascent stages of being an issue on the biotech side with Mexico. There has been an increasing level of bilateral discussion at a pretty high government-to-government level to say, hey guys, what's going on here? It's time to start getting approvals going again. And two, do you really know what you're talking about? Or like, do you know the full impact of potentially banning glyphosate, both for your domestic production and imports? So there's certainly conversations ongoing. We're a long ways from Mexico potentially banning biotech, but like all things international trade, usually the conversations are fairly lengthy to try to keep those things from actually becoming an issue.
Next question I have here is, we've talked a little bit about some of the tools that we have in place, 201s, 301s, 232s, etc. Which of these would be the most helpful for the farm community, and why? And do we are they useful tools? Do they work? Do we have a track record of them working to help out producers that are experiencing some of these difficulties? I don't know if Alex, if you want to try that one, or.
I'm happy to give it a go as long as you promise to ship it back over to Veronica when I'm done. Is that a deal? Okay.
Deal.
Okay, so the answer is definitely yes. These things have been used and are used increasingly in agricultural trade. And so I guess the three that I think about, and you guys correct me and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, but the three I'm thinking about are anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, and then safeguards, right? Special safeguards. And let's see, we've had lemons, tomatoes, sugar. We've had a ton of industries, garlic, be really successful. And I guess I should qualify what I mean by successful. Really successful in some of these in terms of making a case, showing that competition from abroad is not fair, and then the U.S. government successfully responding with duties. But importantly, that is the very first kind of hurdle to this story, right? The fact, do I get duties or not? And then you've got ongoing things of, okay, suppose I get duties on these given countries that were bad actors. The next question comes, well, are other countries going to then import stuff? Are those same countries that face tariffs going to process their stuff a little bit more and send it in? And so those are issues we've had in terms of garlic, which we've had a successful dumping case, tomatoes, which we've had successful dumping cases and countervailing duty cases, and sugar, which we've had cases. And so I guess the point there is that, yes, they can be successful in terms of getting some relief, but importantly, that relief is very temporary. So it's not a long-term solution to any of these kind of underlying trade issues that we're worried about. In terms of the easiest to use, my general idea is that probably thinking from a litigative perspective, the special safeguards, so the blueberries thing that y'all have been talking about seems like the easiest to me, just because you don't have to go through the full litigation process, but I am happy to be completely wrong about that.
I don't think you're wrong at all. I'd add to that the are good for different uses. So the blueberries with a 201, that's the 201 is considered a bit of a global safeguard. So you're looking at imports from a variety of different countries rather than one particular country. That's why, you know, the actions that the administration took last week, they decided to start the 201 investigation on blueberries and maybe not things like strawberries, which are predominantly coming from one country, being Mexico. So that's useful. It's as Alex said, these actions are intended to be temporary. They are intended to give the domestic industry time to adapt to a new competitive environment in order that they're able to make changes that will allow them to be competitive into the future. Things like anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties are intended to be for one particular country. So like anti-dumping, that doesn't necessarily mean what we want it to mean. It doesn't mean that a country is selling when an anti-dumping investigation against them. It's not that it's unfair that they're selling below what our costs are. The anti-dumping comes into play. Are they selling below their cost of production? So that can be harder to prove that case than one might think. And then those duties are intended to be on for 5 years. And then there's a new investigation, in which case, again, it's intended to be a temporary situation to alleviate the unfair practice that was occurring in the other country. So you're punishing them for their bad behavior in the hopes that within the 5-year course of applying those tariffs, they will have changed their behavior. But if there's an underlying competition issue, for for example, on the labor cost side, that won't necessarily be addressed by an anti-dumping duty. The bad behavior of selling it below their cost of production should be fixed in that 5 years, but the underlying competitive elements aren't necessarily promised to go away. So it's sort of all of the a change in response either by the U.S. company or the competitors in the other, but are really temporary measures rather than a long-term solution.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Veronica. And we've talked a little bit today about GMOs. The last questions about GMOs. I know that in addition to GMOs, we've got other types of barriers that competitors put into place when we try to put things into their markets, like geographic indicators on cheeses and wines and things like that. Sanitary, phytosanitary standards. We even have a whole name for this when we're dealing with the European Union, the precautionary principle, right? So what are ways that we can, through negotiation, try to take some of these barriers down? Is it strictly done in the negotiation process, or is also some of those toolbox that you've just mentioned? Is it really, do we really need to focus on the negotiation to get some of these things out of there? Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Who you kicking that to? Yeah.
Yeah. Who do you want to knock that one first?
Let's go with Veronica.
Okay. So it's a really good and interesting question, and I'm glad it was asked, because up until a few years ago, we were really talking about these non-tariff barriers as the largest increasing barriers to trade. So once we're once the tariffs that the U.S. has put in place go away, once the retaliatory tariffs that other countries have put in place against us in response, once those goes away, these non-tariff barriers are still there. So the WTO, in addition to its functionality as having being a body to negotiate new agreements, the second arm is dispute settlement, and the third is notification. So there are, and I know this is very nerdy, but there are standing bodies within the WTO where countries are able to bring up issues that we have with each other on things like sanitary barriers to trade, the non-tariff barrier indicators. These are standing committees where the professional countries get together and talk about it, and it's a way to surface issues before they became issues. It's also in bilateral agreements, and of those trade agreements is talking about SPS and TBT issues. So talked a lot of course about the numeric value of the phase one agreement, but something that we haven't talked much about or sort of gets pushed to the side because it's not nearly as easy to talk about, but are the outcomes from the phase one agreement on the SPS issues. So the US was shut out of the Chinese market for a number of products, things like poultry, that the US should be exporting a lot of poultry to China, and at one point we were, but there were some SPS issues that kept us out of that market. Things like the phase one agreement, bilateral trade agreements allow us to have discussions where we are able to negotiate those non-tariff barriers away. So yes, we can certainly we don't have to be in a negotiation in order to talk about and deal with some of these non-tariff barriers, but sometimes they're in place also obviously for political reasons. And so in order to really get the big ones unstuck, the other country needs to gain something also. So negotiations, multilateral or bilateral, are oftentimes where we see the largest sort of stack of those non-tariff barriers sort of being eliminated. Alex?
Yeah, can I just say a couple things, which I agree with everything Veronica said. I just want to add the nuance that these things that we call non-tariff barriers are not always a bad thing, right? So we in the U.S. use sanitary, phytosanitary barriers, technical barriers to trade very often. Maybe not as much as Europe, but very often, right? And there's a really, I guess, silver lining to some of these things in that when you look at the things like sanitary, phytosanitary standards, technical barriers to trade, most of these apply, like the global safeguards measure, most of these apply to many countries or all countries in the world. The good news about that is that we are a really good and high quality producer as a country. And so if we can meet those barriers where other countries can't, just by nature of being a high income, high quality producer, these things can work to facilitate our trade. So when we worry about a sanitary, phytosanitary standard, TBT, I guess we just have to stop and think, what is the impact of that? It's not always bad. The same story, I guess, goes for geographic indicators. Yes, Europe has some really stringent ones that through the USCMA could potentially hurt us. At the same time, when we think about Michigan, Michigan has that same wonderful reputation of being wholesome, of being high quality. We have the opportunity, I guess, to signal based on potentially creating some geographic indicators of our own to set ourselves apart. So those things, yes, can be used as a protectionist tool to our disadvantage. They also present a lot of opportunities for trade going forward, I think.
John, I can hear you.
It would be helpful if I turned on my microphone. That's good teamwork. Thank you. Well, we are nearing the end of our time here, and I have a few closing comments to make, but definitely for those listening in, feel free to reach out to me, and I can get you in contact with either of our speakers if we have a follow-up question. And this will be recorded as well. But just with some closing comments here, just wanted to mention we want to thank our guests and all those who joined us tonight on MFB's September edition of the Hitching Post. Remember, the video event will be up on Facebook by Thursday this week, so feel free to share it with your network and hopefully within your county policy development committees too. And while you're on the MFB Facebook page, go to the events section and sign up for October's Hitching Post, which will feature Matt Kapp, Michigan Farm Bureau's Government Relations Specialist, as his panel discuss broadband access. One last note, we would love your feedback, so make sure to fill out the quick survey after you leave the event. You will be directed to our public policy page website. It's a great place to catch the latest regarding policy and politics and agriculture. You can also find Michigan Farm Bureau and AFBF's policy books and links to your county farm bureau to connect on these issues locally. Wanted to just mention one more thing. We talked a little bit tonight about 201 investigation and blueberries and what this meant for some specialty crops. There was a story yesterday in Michigan Farm Bureau's Michigan Farm News. So if you haven't read that, I'd encourage you to take a look at that just for a little bit more background on what we talked about this evening. So with that, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Alex. And we'll conclude today's comments.